Welcome, traveler. Tonight we journey back to the American frontier, to a time when winter was more than a season. It was a trial of endurance, a question of survival. Together, we will step into the cabins, the frozen fields, and the silent forests of the early settlers. We will see how they built shelter, fought the cold, stored food, and endured hunger, loneliness, and danger, all while clinging to the fragile hope of spring. This story is not fast or loud. It is slow, steady, unfolding like snow drifting against a cabin wall. Let it carry you gently into another time, while the rhythm of words and the silence between them guide you toward rest. If you wish to return to these journeys through history, remember to subscribe to the channel. Add this video to your favorites, so it will be waiting for you whenever you need calm, or whenever you wish to walk again across the endless frontier. Now, settle in. The fire is warm, the night is quiet, and the story begins. The first snow on the American frontier never arrived quietly. It did not slip into the landscape as a gentle visitor. It came with authority, sweeping down from the distant mountains, rolling across the open plains, and pressing against the walls of rough cabins like a reminder that the easy days had ended. Settlers watched the sky change with a kind of dread. Clouds thickened, winds grew sharp, and the air itself tasted of iron and ice. A thin frost painted the edges of every log, every window, every animal's breath. And then, without hesitation, the flakes began to fall. At first they drifted like feathers, soft and scattered. Children, if they were lucky enough to still hold on to wonder, ran outside with outstretched hands, laughing as the flakes melted against warm skin. But the older ones, the men and women who carried the memory of last winter's hunger and sickness, felt their hearts sink. For each snowflake was a clock striking, a warning that time for preparation had nearly run out. Cabins were checked again, even if they had been checked a dozen times already. Every crack between logs was filled with moss, mud, or rags to keep the wind from slicing through. Roofs were reinforced, their seams packed with clay or straw. A family would walk the perimeter of their small home, running hands along rough wood, listening for rattles where the gale might find purchase. The snow outside was not decoration. It was the beginning of siege. The livestock felt it too. Horses stamped nervously in the frozen dirt, breath rising in white plumes. Chickens huddled together, silent, as if already conserving strength. Cows were led closer to the cabin, into sheds patched with whatever scraps of wood could be found. The settlers knew that animals were not just companions, they were survival. Without milk, without eggs, without the possibility of meat, the months ahead would become impossible. As the storm deepened, darkness came earlier than expected. The sky closed in on itself, swallowing the horizon. The sound of snow was strange, sometimes soft as whispers, sometimes hard as gravel, when wind hurled ice against the walls. Inside, families gathered close to the fire, the only barrier between them and the cold that pressed like a living thing against the door. Children listened to the storm and grew quiet, their laughter drained by the knowledge in their parents' faces. Food was measured more carefully now. A pot of beans might stretch across several meals. Bread was baked sparingly, each loaf guarded as treasure. The sight of snow piling against the window reminded everyone how far away spring was. Outside, the woodpile shrank faster than comfort allowed. Men ventured out with axes, their boots crunching through drifts, faces stung red by wind, to cut more before the next storm buried the trees under ice. The first snowfall was always the heaviest in spirit. It was not yet the deepest, nor the coldest, but it carried the weight of realization. Settlers remembered the neighbors who had not survived the last winter, the cabin where smoke had ceased rising, the family found weak and hollow when the thaw came. That memory lingered with every gust of icy wind. It whispered that survival was never promised. And yet, amidst the fear, there was also a kind of fragile beauty. The land stretched white and endless, silent except for the groan of trees and the crack of frozen streams. Stars burned sharp in the sky once the clouds cleared, their light glittering off the snow like shards of glass. In that stillness, families found a quiet strength. They gathered by the fire, told stories, sang hymns, and held each other close. The storm would rage, but together they would endure, or at least try. The first snowfall was a threshold. Once crossed, there was no turning back. Work became survival. Hope became discipline. The settlers looked out upon the blanketed land and felt the weight of months ahead settle on their shoulders like the snow itself. And still, they rose the next morning, breath clouding in the frozen dawn, to face the endless winter that had only just begun. Building shelter against the cold. On the frontier, winter was not survived by strength alone. It was survived by walls, thick enough to hold the warmth, tight enough to keep the wind from slipping through, strong enough to stand while storms beat against them. When the first frosts came, every settler turned their eyes to the cabin, for the cabin was not just wood and nails. It was hope wrapped in bark and mud, the fragile line between family and the hunger of the cold. Most cabins began as little more than 4 walls of rough-hewn logs, laid one atop another, gaps filled with whatever the land could give. But as autumn faded, those walls had to be reimagined, fortified, turned from houses into fortresses. Men climbed ladders to smear clay into every seam, packing moss and straw into cracks so fine a mouse would struggle to find passage. Inside, wives and children pressed rags into window frames, hung quilts across doorways, and spread animal skins across the floor to keep the icy drafts at bay. Every gap left unsealed was an invitation for death to step inside. The roof demanded equal care. Rain in summer might forgive a leaking seam, but snow would not. Snow grew heavy, pressing down with relentless weight. A roof not properly pitched would sag, then break, burying the cabin in white ruin. Settlers patched shingles with bark, layered sod where nails ran short, tested beams with careful eyes. A man could swing an axe all day for firewood, but if his roof failed, no pile of logs would save him. Not every family had the blessing of a full cabin. Some, too poor or too new to the land, dug into the earth itself, shaping sod houses, half buried, walls of dirt braced with timber. In these crude shelters, cold seeped through the very walls, yet they offered at least a break from the wind. Others leaned poles together and stretched hides across them, temporary lodges borrowed from native neighbors. Every form of shelter was a compromise, but compromise was still better than the open sky. Inside, life was arranged around the fire. Beds were pushed close to the hearth, blankets piled high, children nestled together like pups for warmth. The walls glowed orange in firelight, shadows rising and falling with each flicker of flame. The crackle of wood was not just sound, it was reassurance that the defenses still held, that the night could be kept at a distance. But even inside, the fight never ended. Ice grew on the walls, creeping like a second skin. Water froze in buckets left too far from the fire. Breath rose white from mouths, as if every word spoken belonged to the winter itself. To live through a frontier winter was to learn humility before wood and stone. Shelter had to be tended like a living creature. Walls checked daily. Roof brushed clear of heavy snow. Chimneys cleaned lest smoke clog and suffocate the family meant to be saved. There were stories of cabins lost to fire when sparks leapt to the roof, flames racing through dry thatch faster than men could douse. The choice between freezing and burning haunted every hearth. Still, when storms howled outside and snow buried paths higher than a man's head, the cabin became more than walls. It became a sanctuary. A place where hymns were sung, where bread was broken, where stories rose above the wail of the wind. Children clung to the sound of their parents' voices, and parents clung to the steady rhythm of the fire. Building shelter was not only the first act of preparation. It was the act upon which every other depended. Without strong walls, no food could be cooked, no water melted, no family kept safe. The settlers knew this truth as surely as they knew the bite of the cold. And so, before the storm could claim the land, they claimed their place upon it, raising cabins and sod houses and huts, daring the winter to try and tear them down. The fight for firewood. On the frontier, winter meant war with the cold, and the only weapon sharp enough to fight it was fire. But fire was hungry, greedier than any man, and it demanded wood without end. Every log burned was another log that needed cutting, splitting, stacking. Families measured their chances of survival not in coins or in cattle, but in cords of wood lined neatly against the wall, tall piles that stood like soldiers on guard. When the first snows fell, every settler felt the weight of the question: had they cut enough? There was no such thing as too much firewood. Each night consumed a stack. Each storm devoured a week's worth. The wind stole heat through cracks in walls, forcing the fire to burn hotter, longer. A cabin without wood was a coffin waiting for frost to close its lid. Men spent whole days in the forest, axes ringing sharp through the trees. The sound carried for miles, echoing across frozen ridges, a rhythm as steady as heartbeats. Blades bit into oak and pine, chips flying in bursts of pale color against the snow. Hands blistered, backs ached, but the work did not stop. Even when breath turned to steam and sweat froze against shirts, the axe rose and fell, rose and fell. Once trees were down, the fight grew harder. Logs had to be hauled back to the cabin, sledged across drifts, dragged by horse or by hand. Settlers leaned forward with ropes across their shoulders, straining against the stubborn weight. The snow made every step treacherous. The wind tried to tear the breath from their lungs. Yet still they pulled, for every log brought home was another night promised. Splitting came next, iron wedges hammered deep, wood bursting apart with cracks like distant gunfire. Children gathered the smaller pieces, their arms trembling under the load, while women stacked the splits against cabin walls, building high, tight rows. The piles had to be covered, shielded from storms. Wet wood was worse than none at all, hissing and spitting, giving smoke but no warmth. Inside, the fire was both blessing and danger. Too small, and frost crept across blankets, turned water to ice inside the bucket. Too large, and sparks leapt, threatening to set the roof aflame. Families learned to feed the hearth like a careful child, steady, measured, never left alone. Night after night someone woke to stir coals, to add another log, to make sure the embers never died. For if the fire went out, the cold would rush in like a thief. Neighbors judged one another by their wood piles. A cabin with high stacks was respected, envied, sometimes even asked for help. A cabin with little was pitied, and in desperate winters, pitted families sometimes vanished before spring thawed the ground. Tales spread of men who froze with axes still in their hands, caught by blizzard too far from home. Firewood was not just labor, It was life counted in cords and carried on backs. And yet, in the glow of the fire, warmth softened the harshness. Families gathered around, shadows dancing on rough walls, voices rising in story and song. The wood outside might dwindle, but for a time the room was filled with comfort, with the illusion of safety. The storm could howl, but the hearth answered louder. The fight for firewood was endless, but it was a fight settlers could not refuse. For every log burned was another day of survival purchased. Each spark rising into the chimney was a promise kept for one more night, one more morning, one more chance to see spring. And so the axe kept swinging, the piles kept rising, and the fire never ceased its hunger. Food before the freeze. On the American frontier, the measure of a family's hope was found not in silver, not in land, but in what lay stacked and stored before the first hard freeze. Food was survival, and survival meant preparation. As autumn's warmth drained from the land, every settler felt the pressing weight of the question: had they gathered enough? For once the ground froze and the rivers sealed with ice, there would be no more harvest, no more hunts without peril, no more easy days of gathering. Winter would lock the world, and only what was already within reach would remain. Pantries and cellars became vaults. Corn hung in braided ropes from rafters, yellow gold against the dim wood of cabins. Beans were dried, spread on cloth beneath the weak sun, then poured into sacks and sealed tight. Squash and pumpkins lined the floors, hardy vegetables chosen because they would endure months of cold. Apples, sliced thin, were strung on cords above the fire, turning leathery and sweet as they dried. Meat was salted, smoked, or both, cut into slabs and hung in sheds where smoke curled slow and steady. Every item stored was a victory. Every jar filled a promise whispered to the hungry days ahead. Yet even with all this labor, doubt gnawed at the mind. For the winter had a cruelty of its own, and no family could know how long the cold would linger, how fierce the storms would strike, how many mouths would still be fed when spring thawed the ground. Mothers counted jars again and again, fingers tracing lids, lips moving in prayer. Fathers sharpened knives not for butchery but for rationing, for the grim arithmetic of making little stretch further. Children learned quickly to eat slowly, to savor, for nothing was certain and nothing was endless. The hunt was both blessing and gamble. Men disappeared into the woods at dawn, rifles on shoulders, returning sometimes with deer or elk, sometimes with nothing but frost on their coats. A successful hunt filled the smokehouse with promise. A failed one left silence heavy around the hearth. Traps were set for rabbits, snares for birds, but even these gifts grew scarce when snow buried the land. Hunger waited at the edge of every plan, and the settlers knew it. Water, too, played its part in the struggle. Streams froze, wells iced over, and families melted snow in blackened pots. But snow gave little nourishment. Too much of it left bellies empty and bodies weaker still. True water had to be drawn carefully, hoarded as much as beans or flour. In the heart of winter, every sip counted as much as every bite. Inside the cabin, food became ritual. A pot of stew might simmer for hours, bones and scraps giving flavor to thin broth. Bread baked in iron pans was sliced carefully, each piece shared with reverence. Beans and salt pork might appear again and again, wearying the tongue but feeding the body. No one complained. To complain was to tempt despair. Instead, families gave thanks, for the presence of food meant another day alive. Neighbors sometimes traded when stores ran uneven. A sack of corn for a strip of venison, a jar of beans for a basket of apples. But barter was limited, for every family guarded their reserves. To share was noble, but too much sharing meant weakness, and weakness meant death. And so trust and fear lived side by side, each meal shadowed by the knowledge that hunger could strip civility bare. Still, there were moments of grace. On holidays or Sundays, a family might open a precious jar of honey, or roast meat richer than usual, letting the cabin fill with aromas that reminded them of gentler times. Children's eyes widened at the sight of pies made from stored apples, or a cake mixed from dwindling flour. These feasts were rare, but they stitched hope into the long fabric of winter. Food before the freeze was more than nourishment. It was security, discipline, and faith carved into jars, sacks, and smokehouses. It was the difference between a hearth that glowed with life and one that grew silent before the snow melted. Settlers looked upon their stores not as plenty, but as defense, a wall built against hunger's relentless march. And as the snow deepened outside, they prayed that their work had been enough, that every bean, every grain, every salted strip of meat would carry them across the long, unforgiving months ahead. Water, ice, and survival. On the frontier, water was life. In summer, it ran freely through streams, glistened in wells, sparkled in barrels gathered from rain. But in winter, water turned treacherous. Rivers froze, ponds locked themselves in glass, and wells stiffened until buckets returned heavy with nothing but ice. The settlers knew that without fire to melt snow, without care to guard what little they had stored, thirst would stalk them as mercilessly as hunger. Snow looked abundant, a blanket spread across the world, but it carried deception. Melted in pots, it shrank to little, a handful of slush yielding barely enough to wet lips. Worse, snow taken carelessly, yellowed by animals or fouled by soot, could sicken a family already weak from cold. Mothers taught their children to gather only from the cleanest drifts, away from cabins, away from paths where boots or hooves had passed. Even then, snow had to be boiled, turned safe by fire, stretched into something resembling true water. Those who lived near streams or rivers faced another test. Ice covered the surface thick, daring men to cross, daring them to chop holes in search of what lay beneath. The ice groaned under axes, cracked beneath boots, shifting with a will of its own. Too many stories told of men who slipped through, swallowed by black water so cold it stole breath in an instant. Their bodies, if found at all, were found in spring. And yet, the risk was taken, for thirst pushed harder than fear. Families tied ropes around the waists of those who ventured out, praying that if the ice betrayed them, strong arms could pull them back to life. Wells, too, demanded care. Ropes froze stiff, buckets cracked, pulley wheels stuck with frost. Men carried torches down into the earth, breaking ice from stones, clearing space to reach the water that still hid deep below. The work was dangerous. Fire and wood could eat away the air, darkness could disorient, ladders could break. Still, they went, for water at the bottom of a well was worth more than gold. Inside cabins, water was stored in barrels, jars, even hollowed gourds. Women guarded these supplies fiercely, rationing cups like treasure. Children begged for more, but every swallow had to be measured. A careless spill was a tragedy, a bucket knocked over enough to set panic in a home. Ice sometimes formed even inside, coating the rims of cups, freezing thin layers across buckets set too far from the fire. Waking in the morning to find drinking water frozen solid was a cruel reminder that the enemy never rested. Illness stalked through winter as quietly as the cold. Unboiled water spread fevers. Stale water grew foul, carrying sickness into already fragile bodies. Settlers learned to listen to the taste and smell of every sip. They added herbs when they could, mint or sage, to mask doubts, to turn necessity into something almost comforting. But always the worry lingered. Would the water hold out? Would the wells stay open? Would the ice crush their chances before spring returned? Travelers who came unprepared suffered most. Pioneers caught on trails with no stores scraped snow into leather bags, chewing slush until their lips bled from cold. Hunters learned to eat ice carefully, holding small shards in their mouths until melted, for to swallow too much at once was to risk sickness or pain that could cripple. They spoke of thirst worse than hunger, a hollow dryness that clawed at the throat until voices cracked and lips split wide. Yet there were moments when water, even in winter, offered grace. A thaw might open a creek for a day or two, rushing cold but clear. Families filled buckets with joy, drinking deeply, washing faces, even letting children laugh as they splashed a little before the freeze returned. Those brief days felt like gifts, like promises that the world had not completely hardened against them. Surviving winter on the frontier was not only a matter of food or fire. It was a matter of drops, of sips, of liquid measured more carefully than silver. Every bucket hauled, every pot of snow melted, every hole chopped into a frozen stream was an act of defiance against a land determined to steal breath and strength. And when spring finally came, when rivers broke loose and wells sang again with water, settlers remembered. They remembered the nights of dry mouths, the mornings of frozen buckets, the prayers whispered over boiling pots of snow. And they gave thanks, not just for life, but for the water that had carried them there. Clothing for bitter weather. On the frontier, the difference between life and death often hung on a single layer of cloth or fur. The land gave no mercy to the unprepared, and when the winds sharpened, when the air froze in the lungs, a man's clothing became his armor. Out there, fashion was a word that meant nothing. Function ruled, and every stitch carried weight, every seam carried hope. Wool was the first defense. Heavy coats, coarse and scratchy, wrapped settlers in stubborn warmth. Wool held heat even when damp, clinging to the body like a shield. Mothers unraveled old blankets to knit mittens and socks, their needles clicking through long nights as the fire hissed. A single pair of woolen socks could mean toes saved from frostbite, or toes lost forever to blackness. Leather came next, tough and unyielding. Deerskin leggings, moccasins, and jackets cut from hides turned supple by hours of scraping and stretching. Leather blocked the wind where wool alone failed. It bent with the body, survived snow and rain, and when stitched carefully, lasted through seasons of punishment. Settlers who hunted tanned every hide they could spare, knowing that fur and leather were as valuable as bullets. Then there was fur itself, the luxury of survival. Fox, beaver, rabbit, even wolf, pelts sewn into hats, collars, cloaks. Fur trapped air, wrapped faces, softened the bite of storms. Men tied strips around boots, stuffed extra hides into bedrolls, wrapped babies in fur-lined cradles to keep them breathing through the long nights. Each pelt was more than warmth. It was proof of work, of hunts braved in bitter cold, of animals taken not for pride but for life. Layers were everything. A man wore shirts of homespun linen under wool, wool under leather, leather under fur. Belts tightened to hold it all close, scarves wrapped across mouths until words froze against cloth. Hands hid in mittens stitched double, sometimes layered again with scraps of fur inside. Women sewed quilts into coats, stuffed straw between inner and outer layers, turned every scrap into another barrier against the cold. Children wore clothing patched so many times the original fabric was gone, yet the layers still held, still trapped warmth enough to keep them moving. But clothing was never endless. Boots cracked. Gloves wore thin. Holes opened in coats where the cold slid in like a knife. Settlers patched with anything they could find, bits of sackcloth, patches from worn-out shirts, even bark pressed inside boots to cover holes in soles. Each repair was desperate, yet each kept death at bay for one more day. The dangers were not only from the cold itself, but from sweat. Too much clothing during heavy labor meant heat trapped inside, bodies drenched, and sweat that turned to ice when work stopped. Men chopping would strip coats despite the bitter air, steam rising off their backs. But if they failed to dry themselves quickly, frostbite crept in as sure as any wolf. The balance between warmth and breath was delicate, a lesson paid for in scars. Travelers knew the risks best. Those caught without enough layers on the trail sometimes wrapped themselves in blankets stiffened with frost, huddling near horses for heat. Some did not wake. Stories whispered of pioneers found with boots frozen to their feet, coats stiff as boards, their final breath frozen in beards like white glass. Those stories were warnings passed to children. Never trust the cold, never leave the cabin without enough clothing, never forget that fabric is as vital as food. And yet, amidst the hardship, clothing also gave comfort. Quilts sewn by mothers carried the scent of home, the memory of gentler days. Scarves knitted by sisters wrapped more than throats, they wrapped hearts. A fur-lined hood pulled tight brought not only warmth but courage to step into the storm. Clothing became not just defense but connection, threads tying families together through the long dark. On the frontier, bitter weather stripped life to essentials. A coat was no longer a garment but a fortress. Mittens were not decoration but shields. Boots were not shoes but lifelines. Every stitch was a stand against winter, every patch a declaration of survival. And when spring finally softened the land, when coats were hung heavy on pegs and boots dried by the fire, settlers looked at them not as rags but as companions, worn, scarred, faithful. For without them, no man, woman, or child would have seen the thaw, isolation, and loneliness. Winter on the frontier was not only a battle against the cold, it was a battle against silence. Miles of frozen land stretched in every direction, burying paths beneath snow, cutting cabins off from neighbors, turning every family into an island adrift in a sea of white. The quiet pressed close, heavy as the snow itself, and even the strongest spirits sometimes cracked beneath it. For many settlers, weeks passed without seeing another soul beyond the walls of their cabin. Roads became impassable, rivers locked in ice, trails erased by storms. A journey that might take hours in summer could take days in winter, if it could be made at all. Families who had once spoken freely with neighbors now found themselves staring into the fire, wondering if the other cabins still stood, if smoke still rose from their chimneys, if the people within still lived. Inside, the cabin was both shelter and prison. Days bled into nights, nights into days, broken only by the rituals of fire and food. Men repaired tools, women mended clothing, children played with scraps of wood or cloth, their laughter thin and fleeting. The walls grew smaller each week, pressing in, holding the weight of unspoken fears. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside, silence could be louder still. Loneliness struck hardest when sickness came. A cough that would have been mild in summer became dangerous in winter. Without doctors nearby, without medicines beyond herbs or whiskey, families had no help but their own hands. Mothers watched over fevers in the dark. Fathers prayed over children who wheezed for breath. To know that neighbors were near but unreachable, to know that rescue could not cross the snow, made the isolation feel sharper than knives. Some tried to fight the silence with sound. Families sang hymns at night, voices trembling but together. Stories were told and retold, stretched long, embroidered with imagination. Children listened wide-eyed, even when they had heard the same tale a dozen times. The rhythm of words was a defense, a reminder that voices still carried warmth even when the world outside froze. Others gave way to despair. Diaries from the frontier speak of men staring at walls for hours, of women breaking into sudden tears, of children whispering to dolls or carved figures as if they might answer back. Loneliness wore away at patience, turned small quarrels into sharp arguments, left scars no less painful than frostbite. For some, the silence was too deep, the nights too long, and despair swallowed them whole. And yet, there were sparks of resilience. When storms eased and paths opened, neighbors sometimes braved the snow to visit one another, sleds creaking under gifts of bread or jars of beans. The knock on a frozen door, the sight of another human face, could feel like a miracle. Families who had nearly given up hope were lifted by a simple laugh, a story shared, a hymn sung together. The memory of such visits carried them through the next stretch of isolation. Children bore the loneliness differently. To them, the winter was long, yes, but also strange and full of wonders. Icicles like glass spears hanging from the roof, snow caves dug into drifts, patterns of frost etched like lace across the window. Their curiosity, their small games, softened the silence for their parents, reminding them that even in the hardest season, life still held flickers of joy. But for all the resilience, the truth remained. Isolation was as much an enemy as hunger or cold. The settlers learned to guard against it as carefully as they guarded their food or firewood. They leaned on each other inside the cabin, leaned on hymns and stories, leaned on faith that spring would come. And when finally it did, when trails thawed and rivers ran free, they emerged from their solitude blinking into the sun, grateful not only for survival but for the sound of voices beyond their own walls. The threat of illness. On the frontier, cold and hunger were enemies a family could see. But illness was a shadow that slipped quietly through walls, striking when strength was already worn thin. Winter made every sickness heavier, every cough sharper, every fever hotter. Without doctors near, without medicines beyond roots, herbs, and hope, even the smallest ailment could grow into tragedy. Cabins were warm, but they were also close, crowded, and filled with smoke. Families slept side by side near the hearth, breathing the same stale air. A single cough at night might spread through the room within days, turning strong men into shivering patients, leaving mothers weak as they tried to care for their children. The frontier knew no mercy for those without health, and winter gave illness a perfect place to root. Colds became more than sniffles. They became weeks of rasping throats and raw lungs. A fever that might have faded in summer lingered through the cold months, feeding on exhaustion and malnutrition. Pneumonia haunted the cabins, settling in chests already heavy with smoke from green firewood. Families listened to the rattle in a loved one's breath and prayed it would ease, but often it did not. Frostbite, too, was its own form of illness. Toes, fingers, ears blackened by exposure. The pain gave way to numbness, and numbness gave way to loss. Men who spent too long chopping wood or fetching water returned with hands stiff, skin pale as wax. Women wrapped the injured in cloth, rubbed with snow, prayed warmth would return. Sometimes it did. Sometimes the damage was forever. Herbs and home remedies were the only medicine most families knew. Sage for sore throats, willow bark for fever, mint for upset stomachs. Whiskey was poured to numb pain, to bring restless sleep, to fight chills. Some settlers carried poultices taught by native neighbors, mixtures of roots and bark that gave relief when nothing else worked. But these cures were uncertain, fragile defenses against enemies too large to name. Isolation made illness heavier. A sick child could not be rushed to a doctor if snow blocked the trail. A mother's fever might rage unchecked for weeks, her family forced to watch and wait. The helplessness cut deeper than the cold itself. To hear the sound of someone suffering, knowing that no help could reach them, was a torment the frontier carried every winter. And yet, survival demanded endurance. Families leaned on faith as much as fire. Prayers were whispered in the dark, psalms sung to ease fevered nights. Parents told stories to distract their children from pain, their voices breaking even as they smiled. Small acts of care, a cup of hot broth, a cool cloth pressed to a forehead, became lifelines stronger than any medicine. Illness also carried fear of memory. Settlers remembered neighbors lost in winters past, cabins where laughter had once rung, now silent and empty. Graves marked by rough wooden crosses stood half hidden in the snow, reminders that survival was never promised. Each new cough, each new fever brought back the echo of those losses, the reminder that the frontier demanded payment in lives as well as labor. But there was also resilience. Some winters ended with fewer graves, with families stronger than before. Children grew hardy, immune systems sharpened by struggle. Men and women who had survived sickness carried pride as well as scars, proof that they had faced both storm and shadow and endured. The threat of illness never left. It lingered in every cough, every shiver, every ache. But the settlers learned to live with that shadow, to guard their families with care, with warmth, with vigilance. And when spring returned, when fevers broke and coughs eased, they gave thanks not only for the thaw but for the miracle of health. For out on the frontier, to rise from a sickbed was as great a victory as to survive the cold itself. Predators and unseen dangers. Winter on the frontier stripped away illusions of safety. The snow might look pure, the silence might seem calm, but dangers hid in every shadow. Some walked on four legs, hungry and desperate. Others lay hidden in the very walls and rafters of cabins, waiting for carelessness. The settlers knew that even in the season when nature slept, death prowled close. Wolves were the most feared of the predators. Lean and restless, they circled the edges of herds, eyes glowing in the dark. Their howls pierced the night, chilling hearts already weighed by cold. A lone wolf might be driven off, but a pack was a storm of teeth and speed. Families tethered livestock close, built fires higher, and kept rifles within reach. Stories spread of wolves rushing cabins, driven by hunger so fierce they would attack doors or windows. Men who had faced them swore that their cries were more terrible than the wind itself. Bears, too, were a danger, though winter should have kept them in dens. Some did not sleep, or were woken by hunger. These were the most dangerous of all, gaunt, unpredictable, their strength undimmed. A bear tearing into a smokehouse could destroy months of stored food in a single night. Shots fired often did little but enraged them. Families prayed they would not see one, for such an encounter could end in ruin. But predators were not only beasts. The cold itself had a predator's patience. Ice waited beneath snow, thin crusts over streams that snapped underfoot. A single step could plunge a man into water so frigid it stole breath before he could scream. Fires inside cabins threatened as well. A stray spark from the hearth could catch the thatch, turning shelter into trap. More than one family was lost not to wolves, but to flames racing through their only refuge. Even the cabin itself could betray. Heavy snow piled on roofs until beams cracked. Settlers woke to groans above their heads, rushing outside to knock snow free before the weight brought the roof down. Axes and shovels became as necessary inside the yard as rifles on the trail. And then there were dangers too small to see. Sickness carried in spoiled food, water left too long in barrels, smoke from damp wood that filled cabins with choking air. Children coughed, eyes stung, lungs ached. What seemed like safety could turn against them if vigilance slipped. Travelers on the trail faced yet more unseen threats. Whiteouts blinded eyes, snow swallowing paths until direction vanished. Men wandered in circles, convinced they walked straight. Some were found only in spring, frozen only yards from the road they had meant to follow. Frostbite, creeping unseen, numbed fingers and toes until it was too late. The victim felt only tiredness, only a wish to lie down. Many did, never rising again. Neighbors warned one another of these dangers, passing stories like tools. Of the boy lost to thin ice, of the family trapped by fire, of the hunter who fell asleep in snow and never woke. Such tales were grim, but they were also shields. They taught caution, drilled fear into minds too young to understand how quickly life could vanish. And yet, for every unseen danger, there was also unseen resilience. Families learned to watch the sky, to read the snow, to smell smoke for signs of danger. They kept buckets of water near fires, ropes ready near frozen rivers, rifles loaded by the door. Vigilance became habit. Habit became survival. The frontier was never tame, never safe, never quiet in truth. Predators prowled outside, dangers crept within, and only constant awareness kept a family alive. Still, when dawn broke after a stormy night and the cabin still stood, when livestock still breathed and children still laughed, settlers felt a deep pride. They had seen the dangers, felt them press close, and endured another day. The promise of spring. Winter on the frontier always felt endless. The snow lay deep, the wind howled night after night, and the cold pressed against every wall like an enemy too stubborn to retreat. Families counted the days by the shrinking woodpile, by the jars emptied, by the coughs that lingered. Yet even in the darkest stretch of the season, there was always a whisper that spring would come. That promise, fragile, distant, but steady, kept hearts alive when the body longed to surrender. The first signs were small, almost hidden. A drip of water from the edge of the roof, where icicles thinned and broke into shining shards. A patch of brown earth revealed beneath melting snow, soft and muddy underfoot. The call of a bird not heard for months, tentative, uncertain, but filled with hope. Children were the first to notice, running to parents with eyes wide. The world was changing. Inside the cabins, change carried its own rhythm. Fires burned lower during the day, no longer needing to roar so fiercely. Water in buckets froze less often, and sometimes not at all. Families began to open doors during the warmest hours, letting in fresh air that smelled faintly of earth instead of smoke and ash. The relief was small, but it was enough to lift spirits worn thin by long silence. Yet spring's arrival was no gentle transition. Melting snow turned trails into rivers of mud. Wagons sank, boots filled with water, livestock slipped in the muck. Floods swept through low ground, carrying away fences, sometimes even cabins. The same thaw that promised life also carried danger, and settlers braced themselves for storms that rattled the land as fiercely as winter had. Still, the hope of growth was stronger than the threat of flood. Families began planting gardens, sorting seeds carefully hoarded through the winter. Corn, beans, squash, every handful of seed was treated like treasure, because each promised food beyond what smokehouses and cellars could hold. Tools were sharpened, ground prepared, and children sent to gather stones from thawing fields. Work began even before the earth was fully ready, because no one dared waste a single day of the growing season. Animals, too, felt the change. Horses shook off their winter coats, rolling in patches of soft mud. Chickens stretched their wings in sunlight. Cows gave richer milk, their bodies no longer pressed to the edge of survival. Calves and lambs stumbled into the world, reminders that life always returned, no matter how hard the winter had tried to silence it. For the settlers, the promise of spring was more than warmth. It was freedom from isolation. Trails opened, rivers ran, neighbors arrived on horseback with smiles and embraces. Stories were shared, laughter returned, trade resumed. The silence that had hung heavy in cabins lifted, replaced by the hum of community. People who had wondered all winter if their neighbors had survived now knew, with relief, that they had. Spring also meant memory. Families looked back on the season just past, counting the scars it had left. The empty chairs at tables, the graves marked on hillsides, the hardships endured. They gave thanks for survival, but did not forget the price. Winter always demanded payment, and each spring carried both joy and grief in equal measure. Yet, in the end, spring meant life. Green shoots broke through soil, rivers glittered in the sun, skies filled with birds returning. Children chased each other across thawing fields, their laughter louder than the retreating wind. Women hung blankets in sunlight, watching them billow like sails of ships bound for gentler seas. Men walked the land with eyes lifted, no longer scanning for storms but for signs of growth. The promise of spring was never just the end of winter. It was proof that endurance mattered, that hardship could be met and survived. On the frontier, where every season tested body and soul, spring was victory. And as the land awakened, as buds opened on trees and the air filled with the scent of earth reborn, settlers felt the weight of survival ease. They had endured the silence, the hunger, the dangers. And now, the world itself seemed to whisper back, "You have made it." And so, the long winter of the frontier draws to its quiet close. We have walked beside the settlers through hunger, storms, and silence, and we have seen how hope and endurance carried them into spring. Their struggle was harsh, but their survival is a reminder that even in the darkest season, light always returns. If this journey brought you peace, let it find you again. Subscribe to the channel, so that each new story may come to you without searching. Add this video to your favorites, so it will be here whenever you need it. Whether for rest, reflection, or simply the calm of a voice guiding you through history. Now close your eyes, breathe slow, and let the echoes of the frontier fade into dreams. The snow is melting, the rivers are running, and spring has come at last.